Welcome to 2-Bit Gaming. Today's topic, the Game Boy. Do you remember these things? This is what handheld gaming used to be like. Nintendo even started out with their Game & Watch line of handhelds. Way back when, handheld gaming was only good for wasting a little time, but they just weren't a real alternative to home consoles. Portable gaming was basically a joke. Until Nintendo released the Game Boy. It came out back in 1989, around 4 years after the release of the NES. With the success Nintendo had in the home and the proliferation of video games in the culture, the market was ready for something new. The original Game Boy features a 2.6-inch black and green, spinach green, reflective screen. Its controls are almost identical to the NES controller, so it was immediately familiar to NES fans. Volume and contrast controls allowed you to adjust for optimal display and sound, while headphones could be plugged into the bottom of the unit. Nintendo knew that multiplayer games would be just as popular on the road as they are at home, so they included a link port and cable. It feels kinda heavy by today's standards, but back then, it was a marvel of portable technology. Some of my fondest gaming memories come from playing shrunk-down versions of classics. Everybody knows that it's not the system, but the games that matter, and Nintendo made sure all the favorites would fit in your pocket. They were even fortunate enough to secure Tetris as a pack-in game. It was a story of Russian KGB dirty dealings worthy of a 007 film. But most of all, it meant that in the box on launch day, everybody had a game anyone could pick up and play. I think this was essential to the instant popularity of the Game Boy. People who had never played a game in their life were given a simple, easy to learn, difficult to master game to teach them how to play a video game. Tetris is still probably the most universal game of all time. Super Mario Bros., Metroid, Zelda, and newcomers like Kirby cemented portable gaming as a legitimate alternative to a home console. The Game Boy was so popular that it was sold unchanged for about 6 years. In 1994, Nintendo finally gave us something new. Well, sort of. The Super Game Boy. It plugged into the cartridge slot of the Super Nintendo and allowed players to play Game Boy games on their TVs. You might think it's a pass-through with emulation, but it actually has its own hardware and Game Boy CPU. It had a lot of cool features to enhance Game Boy games, such as colorization and extra sounds. Some Game Boy games were designed to include special features for use on the Super Game Boy. I have to say, it was pretty cool to be able to play your favorite portable games on a full-size TV screen. A year later, in 1995, Nintendo released what would become a standard for all their future handhelds. They gave us color. But not the color we wanted. The Play It Loud series was basically just the same Game Boy we had been playing for years, but in color. Not a color screen, just a paint job. It came in a variety of colors. If you already had a Game Boy, there really wasn't any reason to purchase another. It's almost like a conspiracy. Like someone at Nintendo said,
"We've got to think of a way to trick people into buying more Game Boys.
But everyone already has one.
Make them think they need two.
People aren't stupid.
Oh yes they are. Paint them and tell them it has more attitude. It worked for Sega."
All kidding aside, for those who hadn't taken the portable plunge, the colorful Play It Loud series was much more appealing than the off-white blah original. If you purchased a Play It Loud Game Boy, you probably felt like a sucker 1 year later when Nintendo released the Game Boy Pocket. This is the silver edition. Notice that it doesn't have the battery light of the later versions. It featured the same size screen, came in various colors, and actually fit well in the average pocket, making it much more of a portable system. Although the screen is the same size, it had a better refresh rate and was no longer spinach green. Overall, it's better than the original, but still a minor upgrade. If you had the aging original, you would be hard-pressed to justify the purchase. In Japan, Nintendo released the Game Boy Light in 1997. Unfortunately, it never made it to our shores. This is the Gold Edition. It was barely bigger than the Game Boy Pocket, and the battery cover was shaped funny to fit AA batteries, but the main feature was the Indiglow backlight screen. You know those watches that glow so you can read them at night? Well, that's what the Game Boy Light looks like. It actually works rather well, and lasts pretty long on a set of batteries. It wasn't very popular, due to the availability of first and third-party lighting accessories for the previous Game Boy models, so it is kind of rare even in Japan. In 1998, just 2 years after the release of the Game Boy Pocket, Nintendo stopped teasing us and finally gave us the Game Boy Color. This one is yellow, but it came in a number of colors. You know, I've always thought that the logo was a little too kindergarten-y. Oh well, it was an improvement in every way over the nearly decade-old original Game Boy hardware. Portable games could now rival graphically that of the NES. The screen was sharper, it could display over 32,000 colors, and thanks to a faster processor, flicker and slowdown were almost entirely eliminated. In addition to the link port, it has an infrared communication port, but it wasn't well supported and I've actually never used it. The best part is its backwards compatibility with the entire Game Boy library of games. The Game Boy started out as an off-white green screen pioneer and evolved into a sleek refinement of portable gaming. It would be the last 8-bit system released by Nintendo. Now it's time for Kane's 2 Bits! 1. The Game Boy was the first gaming system that I bought myself. I saved my pennies from cutting lawns and my meager allowance, and finally the day came. I walked into the Toys R Us store, marched past the bikes and trains, and found the video games. I was ready to buy it when I noticed something. I was tempted by the bright and colorful screen of the Sega Game Gear and the Atari Lynx. I had the Game Gear in my hand and was starting to walk away, but then I stopped. For the price of a Game Gear, I could buy a Game Boy and 2 games. My penny pincher side had saved me, and I went home with one of the most important gaming machines of my life, the Game Boy. 2. There are so many great games for the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color that even if for some reason you missed them in the 90s, they're still worth owning a Game Boy for today. Sometimes, if I'm feeling nostalgic, I'll break out the old spinach screen and have a playthrough just to relive simpler times. I highly recommend it. That's my 2 bits. Next time I'm going to talk about the later incarnations of the Game Boy line leading up to the last Game Boy model before the retirement of the brand. If you have any thoughts or stories about the 8-bit Game Boys, please leave a comment or video response. As always, I'm your humble 2-bit gamer. Thanks for watching.